In our module introduction, we talked about how great PMs create leverage by using their product intuition to make great product decisions in the absence of detailed information. However, there are two major challenges most PMs run into that hold them back from effectively developing product intuition. The two major challenges are friction in building good feedback immersion habits, overweighting recency of feedback when evaluating feedback importance. In the previous two lessons, we covered how great PMs create feedback rivers and feedback systems of record to get past these challenges. We explained the three-step process for setting up feedback rivers, as well as the three-step process for setting up feedback systems of record. In this lesson, we'll go more deeply into how to use these systems. There are two ways you can immediately put these systems to use: developing user insight and rapid feature research. The primary way you use these feedback management systems is to develop your user insight. Developing user insight can be split into two parts: developing initial hypotheses on what users want and calibrating those hypotheses. Your feedback river handles the first part, while your feedback system of record helps with the second. To develop your hypotheses on what users want, you have to regularly immerse yourself in the feedback river. This means checking your feedback river daily for short periods of time to get a quick sense of the latest feedback themes, giving you the data points to start spotting patterns in user preferences. It's good to think of your feedback river like a Twitter feed. You don't have to read every single message in the feedback river when looking through it, but rather just skim through it to get a general sense of sentiment. Sachin Reiki even directly compares his feedback river habit to Twitter. I treat the feedback river like Twitter. I just do a quick scroll while waiting in line or in otherwise unusable downtime. Regular, brief immersion tends to be better than intermittent, long periods of immersion. Regular, brief immersion tends to be better for two reasons: easier habit formation and less intuition atrophy. The first reason regular, brief immersion is preferred is because it makes it easier to form good feedback immersion habits. In other terms, consider a person who wants to exercise more. Someone who sets their bar for initiating exercise as a single push-up is much more likely to maintain good exercise habits than someone whose mindset is that they must exercise for an hour and a half each time they start. The same analogy applies to a PM who wants to develop their product intuition muscle. A PM who views feedback immersion as a short scroll through the feedback river is much more likely to maintain their feedback immersion habits than a PM who thinks they have to sit down for an hour and a half each time. The second reason regular brief immersion is preferred is because it prevents intuition atrophy. Intuition atrophy is when your product intuition weakens because you haven't been keeping yourself updated on user feedback. This is because new user feedback provides data points to calibrate your product intuition against. Without these new data points, you risk having an outdated understanding of what users truly want. Sachin Reiki says, building your product intuition is similar to strength training. You can't just do it all at once. You need to repeat it regularly to be effective. When immersing yourself in your feedback river, there are two specific tactics that help you develop your hypotheses faster: examining outliers and context recreation. The first tactic is examining outliers. When you get a particularly negative or positive piece of feedback, examine it further. Understanding who loves your product and why will clue you in on your ideal target audience and how to build for them. In contrast, understanding who hates your product and why will alert you to potential anti-audiences. When examining feedback, we recommend looking at the feedback giver's user profile and contributions to the feedback river. Looking at their profile data helps you understand the demographics of your audience or anti-audience. Looking at their contributions to the feedback river helps you understand your user's context. Seeing other problems they've complained about or features they've particularly liked will give you a better picture of what they really find frustrating or delightful. For an example of how examining positive outliers was helpful in developing product hypotheses, consider a real example at Notejoy. Over time, Notejoy was able to pattern match that the people who loved it the most valued Notejoy for its simplicity and speed. They also noticed that these highly positive users weren't particularly tech-savvy, sometimes even explicitly saying so in their feedback commentary. This allowed the Notejoy product team to develop a hypothesis that their core users wanted intuitiveness and speed, even at the cost of other attributes like customizability. For an example of how examining negative outliers was helpful, consider a different example at Notejoy. At some point, Notejoy got a moderate amount of bad feedback on its search feature. Since people usually wrote in about how much they liked Notejoy's search, the PM delved into the feedback further. They wanted to understand what users were giving the feedback to see if they could pinpoint the cause for bad feedback. As it turned out, most of the negative feedback came from users in international markets. The PM discovered that Notejoy's search simply doesn't work as well for non-English alphabets like Chinese or Cyrillic. However, re-engineering search to perform equally well for other languages would be too heavy of a lift for the return. As a result, the PM developed his hypothesis that their best international product outcomes would come from serving English-speaking countries. The second tactic to help you develop your hypotheses is context recreation. If you see users have a consistent issue, try to replicate the problem yourself. Understanding the actions they're taking and experiencing how the product behaves relative to their expectation helps you better design an intuitive product for them. For example, if help search queries are constantly popping up around certain keywords, it's worth attempting that search in the Help Center to see what the user sees. Most commonly, the user is using different terminology than what you're using. For example, recall the pin versus save Pinterest example. Users thought of saving a post as a save action, whereas Pinterest called the action pinning. This was a problem because help articles are tagged with specific keywords. If the user's searched keywords don't match the help article's tagged keywords, then the user won't be able to solve their problem. Replicating the user search would allow Pinterest to discover this problem. After you've developed hypotheses on what users want, calibrate your understanding with the feedback system of record. When you develop a hypothesis that a particular feature should be highly prioritized, look to the FSOR to see if it is as highly requested as you think it is. If the feature is relatively old, it should rank highly on total requests. Total upvotes represent the absolute number of users who have requested the feature historically. If the feature is relatively new, it should rank highly on recent requests. Recent requests represent the total increase in number of upvotes a feature has received in a given time period, often a month. You want to measure performance on recent requests because it better indicates relative interest in the feature. Since the feature hasn't been around long enough to accumulate a significant amount of requests, it won't rank highly on total requests. The time period you choose to measure recent requests over should be long enough that you can see trends instead of noise. There's lots of day-to-day noise in how many requests any given feature receives. This noise tends to settle out over longer periods of time, and short enough that you can quickly act on the trend after you see it. This is so you can be more responsive as a product team. To illustrate this, consider a case where you can identify trending feature requests within a month. Let's say that you measure trends over a quarter instead. This means you'll realize the importance of an emerging feature request 2 months after you could have potentially done so. A good time period to start with for most companies tends to be a month. The common finding in this hypothesis calibration step is that the feature is highly requested, but there are a number of other features that are even more highly requested. To illustrate this, consider an example at Notejoy. One of Notejoy's competitors, Roam Research, came out with a new feature called bidirectional linking, which enabled a novel approach to organizing notes. A significant amount of feedback began surfacing in the feedback river, also asking for bidirectional linking support for Notejoy. Based on this, Notejoy developed a hypothesis that bidirectional linking was a highly requested feature that should be prioritized. To calibrate that hypothesis, though, they first turned to the FSOR. Since bidirectional linking was a relatively new feature, they measured how it ranked relative to other features on recent requests. It turned out that bidirectional linking was highly requested, but not nearly as much as several other constantly requested features like public note sharing and web clippers. The Notejoy PM hadn't realized this because their meeting chatter tended to orient around the newer, shinier feature requests. Because public note sharing and web clippers were relatively older requests, they registered less prominently in the PM's mind. With the FSOR, though, the Notejoy PM was able to properly calibrate that public note sharing and web clippers were more important to implement first before tackling bidirectional linking. The second way you can immediately use these feedback management systems is to conduct rapid feature research. When you develop a new feature or refine an existing one, you often need to do user research to figure out how to best implement it. Since feature design requires qualitative detail on what users want, you will primarily use your feedback river for this use case. The feedback river won't fully replace your need to do user research, but it will help accelerate how fast you get to key findings. There are two primary ways the feedback river helps in accelerating your user research: initial requirements gathering and user filtering. Initial requirements gathering is getting an initial sense of how to implement your feature. To do initial requirements gathering, search the feedback river for the feature that you're thinking of building. This often yields significant initial insight into what users want without even having to set up dedicated interview time with them. For example, when Notejoy decided to implement tagging, it first searched its Slack feedback river for tagging-related comments. It found comments like, "Implement tagging, but do it like Bear did it, not like Evernote," and "Bear has best-in-class tagging, please do something similar," which was tremendously helpful for designing product specs. Without even investing in user interviews, Notejoy was already able to get direction on how they should design tagging. Remember that a feature might go by different names, so consider how else your users might have described that feature. For example, when researching for its web clipper feature, Notejoy had to also search for alternate terms like clipper or mobile save. The second way feedback rivers help you accelerate user research is through user filtering. A key pain point most PMs face in user research is finding the right users to talk to and getting into a conversation with them. Most users might not actually have the right context for your research and will often respond quite slowly to emails asking for time. Using the feedback river, you can better filter for users who already have an interest in the specific features you are researching and thereby speed up your research. When searching your feedback river, there are 3 feedback qualities that indicate you may want to talk with the user: recent, detailed, and polarized. Recent feedback is judged by the time window of the use case for the feature being requested. If the user feasibly might still be interested in using the feature, they're recent enough. Detailed feedback means the user gave very specific feature implementation ideas. Polarized feedback means the user has strongly advocated for or criticized the idea. Each of these feedback qualities raises the probability that the user is emotionally invested in the feature's implementation or redesign, which makes them more likely to quickly respond to requests to chat. Knowledgeable on their use case, which makes it easier for you to understand how to best build for them. And motivated. Motivated users are often willing to give you more interaction than just a one-off user interview, even enabling you to do back-and-forth iteration in some cases. This tremendously improves the efficiency and effectiveness of your user interview process, helping you more quickly complete your user research. In closing, there are 2 ways you use your feedback river and system of record: to develop user insight and to conduct rapid feature research. Developing user insight creates leverage for you by building your product intuition, enabling you to make great product decisions in the absence of concrete information. Rapid feature research creates leverage for you by improving the efficiency of your user research process. In the next module, we'll cover levered dashboards, another major source of leverage for great PMs.